Hello everyone and welcome to episode 69 of The Sydneyist, the best radio show in Sydney on Sydney. Thank you to Tony for a great promo, and thank you as always to our amazing producer, Sophie Kennedy-White. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly and we're broadcasting from the Alan Slate studio at Eastside Radio on 89.7 FM or streaming on eastsidefm.org. Tonight we're talking streets. We tend to think of streets as just conduits, really, pieces of string joining point A to point B. But in fact, they are much more than that. They're the living rooms of our shared urban lives. And that's what we're talking about this evening. What makes a better street? Before we come to that, though, we have a few little snippets of Sydney news. First of all, most important, the $2.9 billion Parramatta light rail linking Parramatta CBD to Westmead on the one hand and Carlingford on the other is due to open tomorrow. Pretty amazing. After all that time and all that money, it will transform, I believe, Sydney's West, and the next stage is also committed, apparently, which is fabulous. Meanwhile, the University of New South Wales Blue Bottle Watch project is developing an app, you might be pleased to know, to predict when and on which beaches blue bottles will be washed ashore. Not for this summer, sadly, but for next summer, apparently. And still on a marine theme, the Deep Sea Challenger, which is a submersible that took James Cameron to the bottom of the Mariana Trench and, importantly, back again, was designed and engineered in Sydney and is now back in Sydney for the first time in all that time, and is open to the public at the Maritime Museum from today. So you can go and have a clamber around, apparently, which would be rather fun. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly with you on The Sydneyist at Eastside Radio on 89.7 FM. And tonight my guest is the president of Better Streets Australia and also a board member of the World Cycling Alliance, architect Sara Stace. Sara, welcome.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me on the show.
That's an absolute pleasure. We're very keen on streets and walking and cycling, indeed, although cycling gets a bit controversial, and we'll come to that in a minute or two. But look, tell us about Better Streets. Am I right in thinking that you're the founder as well as the president of Better Streets Australia?
Yes, there's several of us who are founders. Okay. So Megan Sharkey, she did her PhD on Better Streets in the UK, in London, and then she brought that here to Australia for us to set up. So I guess you could probably actually attribute it to Megan.
Yeah, we'll call you co-founder.
That's right.
So what is it exactly? I mean, you have this wonderful vision, manifesto, I think it's called. Our vision for Australia is that our streets make people of all ages and abilities, I'm quoting from your website, feel welcome, safe and comfortable to walk, cycle and rest. And based on values of freedom, equality, social justice, responsibility and a world of beauty. All things that are very close to our heart here at the Sydneyist. But, I mean, it sounds wonderful. So what do you do and what do you advocate, I suppose?
Yeah, so we have 5 key recommendations. So anyone who's involved, whether it's an individual or an organisation, agrees to our 5 recommendations. And they are firstly that we think there needs to be more children walking and cycling to school and catching public transport. And we've got some clear KPIs around that. It used to be around 75%. It's now significantly less than that. Mm. We also want to see more crossings built to be able to cross streets easily, particularly around local streets and neighbourhoods. We want to see cars reduced in speed again on those local streets because we actually fundamentally want to see people survive when they cross the street.
Extraordinary.
No, it is too much to ask when you've got 1,400 people a year killed by motor vehicles. So our ask is 30 kilometres an hour as a default urban speed limit instead of 50. We want to support businesses with outdoor dining and streetscape upgrades and trees and planting and so on. And then the 5th one is to build cycleways.
Mm. It doesn't sound very difficult when you put it like that. So let's have a look at those one at a time because they're all interesting and probably all complex and a bit of more of an ask than they sound. 30 Ks. It sounds like a good idea to keep people safe, but 30 Ks. A lot of people will say that's really slow for drivers.
Yeah, when I'm driving, which admittedly isn't all that often, but when I do try driving at 30 kilometres an hour, and it's not that hard. And in fact, my children never notice, firstly. And I've never had a vehicle behind complain or beep or suggest I should be going faster when I'm going on my local streets around the eastern suburbs of Sydney. The reason for 30 is that is the speed at which 95% of people will survive if they're hit by a car. And the survivability drops very rapidly as you get up to 50, which is our current default urban speed limit. If you're hit by an SUV or ute, and let's face it, that is the majority of vehicles being sold these days, your chances of survival drop to around about 30 to 40%. So we...
Even at 50K, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So it's a very steep curve. And so the question shouldn't be, will people accept it? I think the question is, do you want your child to survive if they've been hit? So an example is he's just finished primary school yesterday. But
it is that time of year.
It is that time of the year. He was walking to school. We live quite close by. He just has to cross one street. And this is a couple of years ago. And a driver hit him. And luckily, they were driving really slowly. And so they ran over the front of his feet but didn't crush his toes, but the wing mirror really winded him. And I think if that car had been going even slightly faster, we wouldn't be having this conversation today where it's just an anecdote. And I guess that's, we want every parent to be able to have that story of, my child survived.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is with reduced speeds at the end of the day. And so I don't think the argument should be about whether or not people accept it or like it. It's that I actually want my child to survive, or, we had a cat that got hit and died, the kids had to say goodbye to their family pet. And likewise with elderly people, we do want them to get out and walk, and road speed has a huge impact on people's ability to just get out and walk and enjoy their neighbourhood.
Yes, it's when you put it like that, absolutely. Of course, people will see it as an inhibition, and that's partly because we do have such a car-centric culture, don't we? And even in the middle of the city, where you would think people were more accepting, and I think we've probably all got used to the 40k limits outside schools these days, and everyone is quite obedient, probably because you can get very seriously penalised. But it maybe the mindset is changing. Do you think?
I think in different parts of Australia it is. And we're not talking about turning every single road in Australia to 30 kilometres an hour. We're just saying
just the inner city.
In the inner city areas or in townships, right, where you've got the shops and so on, you actually want people to be able to cross the road. It's actually much better for business.
Yeah.
That if people can cross the street more easily. There was a study that the City of Melbourne did probably about 10 years ago now, that said if you could reduce the crossing time it takes for people to cross the street by just 10% within the Melbourne Hoddle grid, you'd boost the economy by about $2 billion.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive, isn't it?
It's very impressive numbers.
There are countless studies like that from all over the world that show that cities that encourage walking and make walking more enjoyable and easier benefit economically hugely. And it's interesting, therefore, that the people who oppose things like cycleways and speed limits are often business owners, local business owners. I think perhaps they've got the wrong end of the stick or something. But look, so most of the things that you're recommending are about making it easier and safer and more fun to walk, aren't they? I think the figure of 2,560 more pedestrian crossings popped up on your website. I'm thinking, wow, that's I'm not sure. I suppose that's across Australia, and you've also got some advice on how to advocate for a local pedestrian crossing. Do you want to talk us through that for a bit, because that's quite an interesting and obviously experienced process?
Yeah. So our membership comprises. I guess I didn't get into this earlier. We are here to try and facilitate as broad a cross-section of the community as possible. So we're not people who consider ourselves as cyclists, although there are people who are part of our organisation or people who are walkists or walkers or whatever you might want to call yourself. We join together with all sorts of people from climate action groups to concerned parents, the parents and citizens of schools and so on. So it's a very broad church. But what we also want to do is empower. The main purpose is to empower local people to get done what they need in their local street. And we have a cross-section of people who work in government at all three levels of government, who work as consultants, who do this as their everyday work, right through to people who've got no background in this whatsoever. So we had a situation where a parent actually down at Bondi Public School who saw that there was a need for a crossing outside the school, but I think he worked in IT software. He had no idea how he could go about asking his council. So we had a couple of more experienced people who do work in local councils, not that particular one obviously, otherwise there'd be a conflict of interest, who then took him through the process of how to do this, and then we wrote that up as a guide, and then successfully that has been built by Waverley Council since then. So a wonderful, very small microcosm of a success story. But what we're trying to do is give people the tools to empower them to make that change for their local community.
And do you know how many people have used that? Might have sort of deployed. I suppose you probably don't get necessarily feedback.
No, I mean, obviously that one we do know about, but we get other ones too. Like there was a parent in down at Coogee who also had a similar problem, and people jumped in. He put on LinkedIn saying, I've got this problem with a crossing on a state road in this case, and people jumped into the comments and said, oh, you should look up this guide. So I think that's exactly what we want, is that amplifying the voice, amplifying the message, sharing that out, sharing those tools and resources.
Absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it, that so many other countries and cities seem much more able to make this cultural change than we are. I mean, I suppose perhaps we're more Americanized than some, and America being the home of car thinking. But it's I'm wondering whether, about the possibility for cultural change, and whether things like the masses of rezonings that we've seen across Sydney will make things better or worse in that regard. Do you have a view of that, how that might change things?
I think it will depend very much on how it's actually executed. So we know when we look at what the City of Sydney's done, you can get this big uplift in apartment dwellings and so on, more shops coming in, but they're also improving the streetscape and, very importantly, the public space, of which streets form quite a high proportion of public space. But if it's executed poorly, and that's, I think, where a lot of that NIMBYism comes in, people have experience of there being having to share more resources. There's not pools to share. There's a big run on libraries, all those other resources. So I think a large part of it is in the way it's executed. And in my day-to-day work, we do consulting around things like if you do an uplift we looked at, say, Macquarie Park. And if you got a big increase in housing and jobs there, what other services do you need to build around it? But there is a cost to government to do that, and it's quite significant. You need another police station, you need more childcare centres, you need more public parks and so on, you need more primary schools. Who is going to pay for that? So I think, yes, it could be better, but there'll be a very strong sort of push to let's just sort of stick everything in, not worry about this, or leave the streetscapes to councils to deal with.
Yeah, and leaving things. I mean, the City of Sydney is an exceptional council in this regard, but leaving things to councils as a general rule seems to be less than satisfactory when it comes to making beautiful streets. They're
vastly underfunded and under-resourced, and at the end of the day, until very, very recently, local councils have bizarrely not had control of their own streets. So there's these things called traffic committees. I will not go into the minutiae of bureaucracy involved.
I remember traffic committees. They've got police and various things on it.
Yes. So you've got, a member of the state parliament, local government, and you've got one traffic person on there. And they are dictating how our local streets run. So if you wanted to put in a parking bay or a parking meter or a crossing, you'd have to go to this group and get them to approve it. It's a terrible way to run our streets.
And a traffic committee, of course, is charged with making traffic move more smoothly.
Yes.
Presumably.
Well, that's what they think it is.
So what we really should do is rename them pedestrian committees.
Yes, and I think the City of Sydney and, in fact, Liverpool City Council have done that as well. But also the state government shouldn't be having a say in whether a local council gets to do a street upgrade in its own street. They just should get their sticky mitts off it.
Agreed. good moment for a music break.
Feeling groovy. Slow down, you move too fast. You got to make the morning last. Just kicking down the cobblestones, looking for fun and feeling groovy. What you knowin'? I've come to watch your flowers growin'. Ain't you got no rhymes for me? Do-do-do-do, feelin' groovy. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, feelin' groovy.
That was, of course, a little piece of the 59th Bridge Street song, otherwise known as Feeling Groovy, which was written by Paul Simon in 1966, but that was Nicky Parrott singing that, doing a cover of that song in 2024. I'm Elizabeth Farrelly with you on the Sydneyist at Eastside Radio on 89.7 FM, and I'm speaking with Sara Stace about her not-for-profit Better Streets Australia. We've been talking about walking. I, Sarah, have just written a column about jaywalking, and my argument was that jaywalking was not just a right but an obligation on the part of all of us to reprioritise the pedestrian as being the primary species of the city, as opposed to the kind of third or fourth layer down. What do you think about that? I mean, jaywalking is not illegal everywhere. It is illegal in every state in Australia except South Australia, I think. But what do you think about that kind of prioritisation of the walker?
I think it's absolutely fundamental. And if you look at quite a few local governments, but certainly the state government in New South Wales has now completely inverted. They call it the transport hierarchy, or the road user hierarchy. Again, another very bureaucratic term, but essentially it puts pedestrians first on our streets, followed by people riding bicycles, then
they say
people
that.
in public. They say that. I actually think they put stormwater first. If they've got a stormwater drain, they won't put a pedestrian footpath in.
Well, I can't tell you how many streets I've crossed lately where you have to do that kind of three sides of the intersection to get across one little street, and I think it's infuriating and demeaning of the pedestrian, honestly. But I think I read in writing that column, actually, I read this wonderful essay by Virginia Woolf which is called Street Haunting, where she describes a dusk walk in, I think it's probably somewhere around Fitzrovia in London, because I think that's where she lived, and she talks about how it's a sort of transformative experience. She says she becomes a central oyster of perceptiveness, an enormous eye, how beautiful the street is in winter. And she talks about the change that comes with that sense of a loss of self, I guess, when you just become open to the place and the community and how lovely it is. And her imagination goes into all these lives and windows that she's looking at. But it takes you, I think, to the question of aesthetics and why beauty matters in streets. So what would you say about that question? We tend to downgrade aesthetics in the same way that we downgrade pedestrians, but surely it's important to make our streets more enticing for walkers.
I completely agree. It's walking, and I'd say it's similar with cycling. It's about joy.
Yeah.
We actually want joy.
It's about that.
Yes.
We can't talk about that in public, but
Well, we do. Given that I write active transport strategies for councils, I do try
You put
and
words like joy in them. Excellent. Good.
Because fundamentally, if you watch toddlers, young, they're just out there opening and closing gates and smelling flowers and stopping to pat cats and things like that. It's about the joy. And similarly with older people, they just want to sit and stop sometimes when they're walking up the hill. We want to bring the fun back to walking.
Yeah, and that sense of curiosity and adventure that you can have if you are a walker, and if the street is the kind of street which rewards curiosity, in other words, offers you things to sort of poke your nose around corners and discover things, that sense is really liberating, I think. And one of the curious things, and this I think brings us probably to the cycling question, because it relies, that sense of trust, I think, on the part of the walker relies on being so safe that you can meander and stop and, smell the roses, probably literally. So how do we balance the needs of that kind of walking with the desires of cyclists to be safe and therefore cycle on footpaths?
So, across Australia, only in every state except Victoria and New South Wales, it's legal to ride on any footpath at all. In Victoria and New South Wales, we've resisted that, in part because I guess there's more people, the footpath's more crowded. I think, yes, we really do not want people to have to ride on the footpath, but I can totally understand why. And of course, you can ride on the footpath if you're under the age of 16 or you're accompanying a child. But I guess I'm going to have to tell a joke if that's okay.
Absolutely.
All
We
right.
like jokes.
We like jokes. Excellent. So essentially, you've got sitting at the pub a motorist, a pedestrian and a bike rider, and there's 6 drinks in front of them, and the motorist takes 5 of the beers and says to the pedestrian, "Watch out, the bike rider's going to take your drink." That's what we're talking about when we're talking about that sort of use of road space. Actually, the question shouldn't be whether or not we bike riders, and they absolutely should not be having to share that with pedestrians, because exactly as you said, you're then on high alert as a pedestrian and you should just be relaxed and enjoying yourself. But it does mean that we need to allocate some of that space from driving and parking to being able to get those bike riders on there. Yeah.
And that is a very vexed topic, especially in Paddington, where we are right now, because we are conscious that there's been a long-term issue about the Oxford Street Cycleway, which is, was going to be Oxford Street, and then it's moved to Moore Park Road, and now it's going to move back again, I think, or maybe it is, or maybe it's not. And there's everybody has views of it, and nobody thinks anything's a good idea, as far as I can tell. But there are all sorts of reasons, many of which are probably not really truthful, about why a cycleway is a really bad thing for people and businesses and churches and funeral parlours and schools and anything on the street, anything business or function that opens off the street. So how do we deal with that? Is there a real issue, do you think, for example, with churches where people have to go to funerals, or schools where people have to come in the front gate? Is there a safety issue there?
Yeah, well, safety for whom,
yes,
and access for whom. So when we know, if you look at the Burke Street Cycleway in Surrey Hills, that was extremely controversial at the time.
Yes.
And now you see school children, I ride on there several times a week, and you see all these school children, mums and dads and kids and scooters and dogs, and it's used by people in wheelchairs as well, because it's much smoother than going on the general footpath. You're not having to go up and down every curb. And so the other wonderful thing about cycleways is they create a buffer. So between the fast-moving traffic and the footpath, you actually get a buffer zone, which is people travelling at, say, 30 kilometres an hour rather than 50 in a big SUV. So it does create, I think, a whole lot of advantages for people who are walking. One is they're not on the footpath, as we've talked about. The other one is it creates a little bit of a buffer. It means that every person who's riding a bike for transport isn't then needing to find car parking at the end of their trip.
Yes.
Or if they're trip chaining, which means as in they're dropping kids at school and then they're dropping at the doctor's and then they're going on to work or whatever they're doing, they're not having to then find a parking space because they're on the bike.
And so the parking question sort of resolves itself,
yes,
you would argue.
Yes, it definitely does. I mean, at my kids' local primary school, there are usually around 10 families every year who've got a cargo bike. A cargo bike is where you can fit sort of a couple of kids in there, maybe a dog.
Yes,
and
they look great.
They do. And
Child as cargo. I like
that's
it.
right. And they're not having to find a car parking space, and they pull up, the kids hop out, they have a little chat, and then they continue on to their next sort of activity. And so every single one of those represents a car not competing with you for parking.
So actually you as business owners or people feeling threatened by cycleways should be thankful, really.
Yeah, it's great for business.
Yes. And also, I think there's some interesting studies about, I read something recently that pedestrians psychologically perceive vehicles as predators. That and that's why it makes you feel stressed to walk along the Parramatta Road, which is roaring traffic. Which is extremely unpleasant experience. And that's the reason for it, that in some primate part of our brain we're feeling predated upon, which makes perfect sense to me. So cycle lanes have that, and the buffer thing and the reduction in noise has that probably spin-off benefit.
It does. It has a really lovely psychological effect. And if you're sort of unsure about that, then I suggest walking down somewhere like Burke Street Cycleway. Burke Street used to be a major thoroughfare. So, and the other one is that there's a lot of studies globally showing that people who are walking and cycling spend a lot more at shops than people who are driving.
Indeed, and there's huge spin-offs. And there's a benefit for public transport out of both of these, because am I right? It increases the usage by making it more accessible.
Yeah, I mean, basically every single bus or train trip does start or end with walking. So it's really important that if you want more people to catch public transport, you fundamentally need to make it easier to walk to the bus stop.
Absolutely. So look, back onto this question of cycling, because I, as a cyclist, and I have been a cyclist very often myself, you feel that same sense of freedom and joy and so on. But as a walker, you do easily feel threatened. So if we were able, as I think you advocate, to generate a network of separated cycleways, would we then completely ban bikes on footpaths, and would we register bicycles? Another vexed topic.
The registration question, basically the cost of running such a system would be not make any sense. And do you make children register? Do you need to register a bike just because you've ridden to the local shop? So registration's really problematic.
I wouldn't have suggested it, except that now with e-bikes and so many, many of which are almost motorbikes,
they're illegal. They are actually breaking the law.
Are they?
Yeah. So there are very strict regulations around e-bikes in Australia. So they can't assist you for more than 25 kilometres an hour, and they can't go above a certain wattage. So if you see ones where
there's a lot of illegal bikes around in that case.
There's a lot of illegal bikes. They get around some of that in places like the Europe, where they've got a next stage up. So if you can get an e-bike that assists you up to 45 kilometres an hour, but you must wear a helmet and you must register and have a driver's license. So they've got a registerable system. We don't have that in Australia.
So a better answer is just to crack down on the illegal bikes? Or,
yes,
yeah.
I suppose so. Which is hard.
Yeah, tricky. That we've come just about to the end of our time. It seems to go in a flash when we're having a good conversation like this. Sara Stace, thank you so much for talking with us. That was great. We have been talking about bicycles. Next week we'll talk again about the Oxford Street Cycleway. Thank you for joining us on the Sydneyist, and we're handing over to the Vinyl Frontier with Yon. Good night.